Hello, everybody. Welcome to your final lecture of the semester, 26.2, The Conservative Turn. We're going to start with Ford and Carter in the 1970s and move into Reagan in the 1980s. And we're going to start with a quote from Reagan: "Trust but verify. Doverai no proverai," or something along those lines. It is an old Russian proverb quoted to the point of frustration by Ronald Reagan to the Russian Premier Mikhail Gorbachev. Reagan loved that phrase. Gorbachev did not like it at the end there. So let's look at the end of the Golden Age, sort of the bubble bursting after World War II a little bit. So for the first time after World War II, the economy went downhill in the 1970s. And this happened for quite a few reasons. First of all, we were no longer the country that made stuff quite as much. We were no longer in the manufacturing superpower that we once were. Instead, we had started encouraging businesses to buy from foreign companies, including and especially countries that were our allies in the Cold War. Now, American companies also sent their manufacturings out to places like Germany, Japan, and Taiwan, meaning we were sending sort of American jobs overseas. So we were importing a lot of our stuff, but sending fewer of our goods overseas to sell. Now, in 1980, about 75% of our goods were competing with foreign goods, and the number of jobs of manufacturing, making stuff in the United States was going way down. In 1971, Nixon took America off the gold standard, meaning our currency was no longer based on how much gold we had. Instead, now it was based on sort of the confidence in the American dollar internationally. This is known as fiat currency, and he hoped that by doing this, he would actually lower the value of the dollar overseas, which would get other countries to buy more stuff from us. However, in the end, it just sort of made the world economy more shaky in general. Now, Americans' prosperity during this time was also damaged by our foreign policy. In 1973, Israel got into a short war with its Arab. I'm going to fix that because that's bothering me. I meant to say neighbors when I said allies right there. So let's try that again. Israel got into a brief war with its Arab neighbors in 1973, and America backed Israel during this time. Now, to punish us, the OPEC nations, the oil producing nations and exporters of the world, quadrupled the price of oil and also very severely cut back on the amount of oil they were giving to the United States. This is called the oil embargo, and it led to a huge shortage on things like gas. And people were waiting all day in lines to fill up their cars, and you could only do it on certain days based on the number of your license plate. So here is a gas station during the oil embargo, and gas stations would often frequently run out of gas and be like, "Sorry guys, come back tomorrow." Now, this shortage also led to America looking for our own energy resources. So while the rest of the economy was going down, we did see a slight rise in American oil, natural gas, and coal. But the rest of our economy was suffering from what is called stagflation. Stagflation is when you have bad economic growth but high inflation at the same time. Usually you have one but not both. This time we had both. Now, as unemployment was growing, people in America also stopped buying the big American cars and instead went for the smaller, more fuel efficient Japanese ones. So, for instance, this 1970s Datsun 510. Now, economic problems was one of the many issues frustrating Gerald Ford. Ford had a rough time in office. He was not in office for very long, and he kicked it off by pardoning Richard Nixon of any crimes that he committed or may have committed while President of the United States. Ford did this out of good intentions. He wanted to get the nation past Watergate, stop fixating on it. However, instead, he just kind of made everybody angry. They felt that he was covering for Nixon and was denying us the justice that people wanted at the time. Now, Ford did try to lower inflation by getting Congress to cut taxes on big businesses and trying to lower government regulation, but the Democrats in Congress basically said no. Ford also told Americans that you're being a little too overspendy. You need to be a little more careful with your money. And America was not interested in hearing that from their president at that time. Carter had sort of the same issue. Ford was sending out these win pins, whip of inflation now, that people were supposed to wear. It did not go as well as he hoped, I believe. Now, internationally, he was a little more successful. He continued this idea of détente, of lessening tensions between the United States and Russia. He got the Helsinki Accords in 1975, where both the US and USSR agreed to respect the boundaries of post World War II Europe. That meant that neither side would try to sort of take over more of Europe. We also agreed to respect the rights of European citizens. Now, in 1976, Gerald Ford lost the presidency to a very little known governor of Georgia by the name of Jimmy Carter. Carter was a former peanut farmer and was almost completely unknown in Washington, D.C., but he actually used that to his advantage because at that time, completely unknown in Washington, D.C. after Watergate is exactly what the nation is looking for. And so Carter focused on things like political honesty, naturally, after Watergate, government efficiency, environmental protection, and rights for African Americans. So here's our 39th president, Jimmy Carter, president from 77 to 81. He's from Georgia. He's a former lieutenant in the U.S. Navy, former peanut farmer, member of the Georgia State Senate, and the governor of Georgia. He also once reported seeing an unidentified flying object. Now, whether it was an alien or not, he did not say, but I mean, obviously it was an alien. So, he also won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2002, sort of for acting as an intermediary between feuding regions of the Middle East. So, Jimmy Carter faced a lot of similar problems to Gerald Ford. There was a big portion of the Democratic Party who said, we just don't want to do politics. Let's focus on New Dealish type stuff, race relations, gender equality, environmentalism. But Carter was more moderate, and he realized we needed to fix the economy, and he actually went kind of more what you would see from a Republican in what he did. He cut government funding for domestic issues like Medicare, Medicaid, welfare, so on and so forth. He allowed for the deregulation of big businesses. He also allowed mortgage companies to actually raise interest rates, and that was bad for people trying to buy houses. He also pushed for higher interest rates across the board. But, however, inflation continued, and this is partially due to the fact that the oil crisis continued, partially due to the overthrow of the Shah of Iran, who is an American ally, and we're going to see this in the Iranian hostage crisis. So, Carter was also pushing for more nuclear power plants at this time. This was seen as sort of a better high-tech option, better than using gas. Unfortunately, nuclear power comes with its own dangers, as we saw after the release of radioactive steam from 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania. This was an accident, but it led to a stop on nuclear power plants. Carter, who had also been hyping up nuclear power as the solution to the gas problem, was suddenly criticized for his point of view. Carter also tended to give speeches again, kind of like what Ford did, sort of shaking his finger at America and saying, you all should do better. He said that America was having a crisis of confidence and that we were too focused on buying things. And again, whether he was right or wrong, I leave that up to you, but America did not want to hear it at that time. So here is 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania. Now, Carter was also working to promote human rights during this time throughout the world, which was a shift from a lot of foreign policy during the Cold War, which was almost entirely about, are they communist or are they not? If they're not communist, we will help them out. He tried to pick sides based on human rights in places like Nicaragua and El Salvador. We'll see those guys come back in the 1980s. Carter also cut off financial aid to Argentina due to their human rights abuses, even though they were a longtime ally against the communists, the Argentinians. He also invited the leaders of Israel and Egypt to come to America to try to work out their problems in what is called the Camp David Peace Accords, which actually brought about peace between the two nations, at least for the moment. However, he could not cut off support everywhere, and we still did side with some areas that were not communist but not great to their people, and this is what happened in Iran. So here is Jimmy Carter and President Anwar Sadat of Egypt and the Prime Minister Menachem Begin of Israel at the Camp David peace accords. There are a lot of pictures of them doing that three-person handshake right there. So Iran was a very important location strategically. There was a reason that we could not give them up or let them down. And it was partially because they were an oil producing nation, partially because they were friendly towards the United States in the Middle East, and partially because they were right up against the Soviet Union and the satellite states of the Soviet Union. Unfortunately, we were also supporting them during the time when the Shah of Iran was very brutally cracking down on dissenters within his own country. The Shah had been in power since the 1950s, and America's continued support of him led to a very strong anti-American sentiment in the Middle East. And then in early 1979, an exiled cleric, Iranian cleric known as the Ayatollah Khomeini, Ayatollah is his title, not his name, instigated an Iranian revolution that overthrew the Shah of Iran. So here's where Iran is, and you can see it's right up against a lot of Soviet satellite states. And here are some Iranian protesters with pictures of the Ayatollah Khomeini. Now, the Iranian revolution saw a move from socialism in the Middle East and nationalism more towards Islamic fundamentalism. Also, after we allowed the Shah of Iran to come to America for cancer treatment, the Iranians, very upset with us, took over the American embassy in Tehran. And for over a year, the Iranians kept over 50 American hostages inside the embassy. And this wrecked Carter's popularity and his re-election campaign, too. He was seen as unable to free them. He even tried a rescue mission that failed. It literally crashed and burned. The hostages were not released until the day that his successor was put into office. They were released the day that Ronald Reagan became president in January of 1981. So here are some of the Iranian hostages. And here they are coming home on that day. And also in 1979, the Soviets are sending troops into Afghanistan to help kind of prop up one of their Soviet allies. This led to a full-on war between the Soviets and groups of Afghan nationalists, oftentimes known as the Mujahideen. This was a 10-year war between the Afghan people and the Soviets. This was basically the USSR's Vietnam. It severely weakened Soviet strength and in the end helped to bring an end to the Soviet Union. However, at first, it also seemed to show American weaknesses. We cut off ties with the USSR and even backed out of the Olympics. It looked like we were sort of backing away. Eventually, though, we started to funnel money to anti-Soviet forces in Afghanistan throughout the 1980s, and this eventually helped to kick out the Russians out of Afghanistan. Unfortunately, a lot of these Mujahideen soldiers ended up forming groups like the Taliban, and that came back to haunt us during the War on Terror and 9/11 and our own misadventures in Afghanistan as well. So here are the Soviets invading Afghanistan during that time. And now let's look at the rising tide of conservatism in the late 70s and the early 80s. So domestic and international issues sort of helped the conservative movement grow during the 1970s. At a time when a lot of Americans were low on money, the economy was tanking, conservatives were offering things like low taxes, less government interference with your businesses, cuts in social welfare, and all of this sounded to a lot of Americans who were suffering from economic issues as a pretty good deal. Also, a lot of Americans were very worried about the perceived loss of America's sort of our stature around the world, sort of our face around the world had sort of gone down, and so this. They also were upset, a lot of white Americans were upset that liberals seemed to have this sort of perceived favoritism towards minority groups, and this caused resentment amongst white America who felt that they were being ignored. We saw that during affirmative action, that a lot of lawsuits were coming from white people claiming reverse racism, basically. Now, much of the old conservatism had left sort of the old way of speaking about conservatism had left. So they were no longer the segregation forever group of George Wallace's. Instead, they talked about local personal freedom, which appealed to many white suburban conservatives instead. Modern conservative also started as a grassroots movement focused on winning local elections, mayors, school boards, local elections instead of big national elections. This led to the neoconservative movement, which began in the 1960s, and it was sort of a pushback against the counterculture movement that we saw in the 1960s. They felt that the counterculture movement was causing the moral decline of America. And they believed that government intervention, even with good intentions, even if if the government thought that they were doing good, but they were interfering with things like business, then that would have negative consequences. For instance, they believed that social welfare programs promoted laziness and sort of just living off of the government handouts, and it promoted single parent families. They believed that high taxes on businesses hurt innovation and growth during that time. So, the conservative movement was also fueled by the re-rise, I would say. We've had a couple of, this is sometimes called the Third Great Awakening, of religious fundamentalism in the 1970s. So, we see the number of church-going Americans going down, but the number of Americans going to evangelical churches are going up. Uh, Evangelical Christians saw the growth of the counterculture movement as sort of the abandonment of traditional Christian values and the downfall of American values, which should tell you something, that American and Christian values by evangelical Christians were viewed as sort of the same thing. They were calling for a return to public faith, a return to the ways of the past. They wanted things like prayer in public schools, an end to the sale of pornography, and the removal of legalized abortion within the United States. Now, in 1979, a religious minister named Jerry Falwell created the Moral Majority, which was a sort of coalition of conservative religious and political people. He rallied against abortion, divorce, and also he sort of added religion to politics. So he's talking about moral issues and sort of family values issues, but he's also saying we are severely underprepared for fighting the Russians as well. And so it's sort of a bit of column A and a bit of column B. He was especially against sexually uninhibited Americans, abortion rights, gay rights, things like that in America. So here is the Reverend Jerry Falwell, 1933 to 2007, from Virginia. He was a pastor, a televangelist, and also the founder of Liberty University in Virginia. A quote from him is, "The idea that religion and politics don't mix was invented by the devil to keep Christians from running their own country." And that is not hyperbole, that is not him being sarcastic. He straight up believed that. So, one of the biggest battlegrounds over family values in America was the Equal Rights Amendment in the 1970s. The Equal Rights Amendment said that the U.S. government shall not inhibit equality of the sexes under the constitutional law. And this was first tried in the 1920s, but it never passed. Now, it looked like it was going to pass in the early 70s. However, it met strong resistance from a set of groups who believed that it was going against the traditional role of women being in the home. So it passed through Congress, but then it needed to get 38 states to say yes, and that's where they ran into trouble, at the local state level. So here's a pro-ERA march in the 1970s. Now, one of the main opponents of the ERA was a woman from St. Louis named Phyllis Schlafly. She believed that the ERA was taking away women's right to basically be mothers and to be homemakers. She was worried that it was going to force women out into the workplace. She also said that this was she used the word divinely appointed place for women was in the home. She believed that the modern American home, with all of its technology, also left women with very little to complain about. A lot of their jobs were already done for them, and that the ERA would diminish the responsibilities of men as well. And so, due to the conservative backlash against it, and even though a lot of Americans supported it, the ERA amendment failed to pass, and it still has not passed up through today. So here's Phyllis Schlafly, 1924 to 2016, from St. Louis, although she lived in Alton, Illinois for a chunk of her life as well. She founded the conservative interest group the Eagle Forum in 1972, ran for Congress in 1952, and a quote from her is, "What I am defending is the real rights of a woman. A woman should have the right to be in the home as a wife and mother." Now, similar to this, we also saw the abortion movement and controversy growing during this time. This is right after Roe v. Wade legalized abortion within the United States. And the Christian base of the conservative movement believed that life began at conception and that any form of abortion should be illegal. They were lobbying Congress to remove things like they removed a section of Medicare that protected the rights of poor women to have abortions in 1976. By the 90s, we are seeing a rise to the point where, and I'm not saying all abortion groups are doing this, but sort of the fringe abortion activists were shooting doctors, and the guy who set off the bomb at the Atlanta Olympics in 1996 did it to sort of show his anger at the abortions going on in America. And of course, abortion still remains a highly divisive issue up through today, with the overturning of Roe v. Wade very recently. So here's a pro-life protest in 1973. Now, by the late 1970s, social and religious conservative groups had grown in strength. They were helped by the low approval of the Carter administration. In 1980, Ronald Reagan's campaign kind of coalesced a lot of these conservative groups, those who wanted stronger national defense, those who believed that America had lost its way, the states' rights conservative groups, the religious rights, the moral right groups. And Ronald Reagan spoke out against government welfare, against affirmative action, against the Equal Rights Amendment, and his win in 1980 was huge. It is considered the beginning of what was called the conservative Reagan Revolution, and we can still see that Reagan is still almost the patron saint of modern conservatism. So here's our 40th president, Ronald Reagan, 1981 to 89, from Illinois, but he lived in California for a good chunk of his life. He's a former actor, former head of the Screen Actors Guild, the union of actors, and former governor of California. He was known especially for his love of jelly beans. There are a lot of pictures of him with jelly beans on his desk, and that's because after he gave up smoking, he was like, well, I gotta have something, and so he started chewing on jelly beans instead. He's also our first president to have ever gotten a divorce. He divorced the actress Jane Wyman and married his wife Nancy Reagan. So here is Reagan's massive win in 1980. He really beat up on Carter. Now, let's look at the Reagan Revolution of the 80s. Reagan had an unusual path to the White House. Like I said, he was an actor. He was actually a New Dealer during the 1930s, and he was also the head of the Screen Actors Guild. He's the only union head who ever became president. However, by 1964, he had shifted gears, and he supported the conservative Barry Goldwater campaign in 1964. In 68, he became the governor of California. He challenged Gerald Ford for the Republican Party nomination in 1976 and nearly got it. And then by 1980, he was incredibly popular, very big in the Republican Party, and he was able to sort of unite these conservative groups, from suburbanites to urban factory workers to the religious right to anti-communist hardliners to libertarians and everyone else in between. Now, Reagan was seen by some as more kind of managerial. He would come up with these big, broad outlines, and then he would delegate to the people underneath him. However, he was also very good at getting his points across. You don't earn the nickname the Great Communicator for no reason. He also made conservative ideas seem moderate and sensible and even in some ways liberal through his rhetoric. He was very good at explaining things and getting people on his side. He was also very good on controlling the public debate, and he oftentimes had to work on keeping his rather large conservative coalition together as one group as well. Now, much like presidents like FDR and Lyndon Johnson, Reagan spoke of economic freedom, but his version of economic freedom was different than the democratic version of economic freedom. His version focused on cutting back the power of the labor unions, getting rid of government regulations, and cutting back on taxes. Over the course of his presidency, Reagan dropped the tax rate on the wealthiest Americans from 70% down to 28%. So this was he was lowering the progressive income tax. His agency heads and cabinet members were also doing this for him throughout his various departments and cabinets. Now, this was all a huge departure from the FDR policy of sort of like, if you want to fix the government and if you want to fix economic problems, fight poverty and fight failing economies in America. Instead, Reagan saw the problem as the federal government spending money. It was the cause of the bad economy, and basically said the government should stay out of the business arena. At one point, he said, "The government is not the solution. The government is not the solution to the problem. Government is the problem instead." Reagan believed in what he called supply-side economics, sometimes called trickle-down economics, according to his critics. He believed that, if you give tax cuts to the wealthy, if you give tax cuts to the big corporations, keep out government regulation, then the corporations will make money, and the money will flow down to the people who work for it instead. And they will also, big businesses will be good corporate citizens and donate to charities and things like that. Now, this is what he thought. In practice, it didn't work quite as well as he had hoped. But he thought it would give kind of tax cuts to the workers who would be working under them, and that they would make more money off of their jobs. Now, despite being the head of a former union, Reagan fought against the power of unions as president. So, for instance, in 1981, the aircraft workers went on strike. The aircraft controllers, the guys who land the planes, went on strike. And Reagan, instead of dealing with them, actually fired them and called in the military to do their work until new workers could be trained. And after this, a lot of private businesses realized that the president would have their back. And so they simply they started hiring new workers instead of trying to deal with strikers in a lot of situations. The 1980s also saw manufacturing jobs continuing to go down from 600,000 workers in 73 to 170,000 workers by the mid-1990s. So we're not making as much stuff as we used to. We're exporting a lot of those jobs overseas. So here are some of the striking aircraft workers in 81. At first, it didn't seem like his economic plans were working. They were sometimes called Reaganomics by his critics. It seemed like America was actually hitting its worst recession since the beginning of the Great Depression. However, slowly it started to go in upwards. Our economy started to improve. American companies were making more money, although they were sending more jobs overseas. And new innovations such as satellite technology and things like that were helping the economy, as did the increase in oil production that we saw during the 1980s as well. So by the end of the Reagan presidency, our country's output had gone up quite a bit, and unemployment had dropped to 5.5%. Now, the major issue of supply-side economics was wealth inequality. The wealthiest Americans now controlled almost a majority of America's wealth. Meanwhile, the poorest of Americans saw their wealth go down throughout the 80s and 90s. Another issue is that, according to supply-side economics, big corporations are going to do things like spend on charities and invest money in their corporations. However, that's not what they often did. They were spending it instead on luxury goods and bigger yachts and buying private islands and things like that. They were also using it to buy corporate buyouts and, buy other companies and things like that. So the rise in poverty mixed with the decrease in money spent on the mentally ill also meant that we saw a huge rise in homelessness in America in the 1980s as well. So here we see the percentage change in real income among the poorest Americans and the wealthiest Americans during the 1980s. Now, this was especially hard for African American workers. Even though Jim Crow is over legally, black families oftentimes were the last to see economic improvements and they were often still the last ones hired and the first ones fired. And the shutdown of these plants across America and the factories across America led to massive unemployment in minority households. It was over twice the national average. They were also generally not given a lot of the best tech jobs, and they weren't given the option to go to school to learn this new technical education, and so they couldn't improve their jobs after they were fired. Now, the 1980s can be seen as sort of a second Gilded Age during this time. Um, this was a situation in which money was being made in stocks and acquisitions of companies. However, we see a decline in us actually producing things during this time, or output. We're just moving money around, to quote Hamilton. It led to a celebration of greed and extravagant lifestyles during this time. People believe that greed is a benefit, not a vice. Especially the young urban professionals of this time who were very much focused on uh, getting the best job, working long hours so that you could take the big awesome vacations and live in the huge house and stuff like that. Young urban professionals got the nickname yuppies during this time, and they worked hard to get all the outward signs of wealth. America was also spending a lot more time and money on our military during this time, leading to a huge budget deficit because we were spending money on the military, but we were not making it back in production. So, despite all this, Reagan, even though he had these ups and downs, the economy was getting better, but there were these problems with the economy at the same time. He remained incredibly popular among his base, and that led him to win a massive re-election in 1984. So here is the Yuppie Handbook with all the signs of 1980s luxury, like LL Bean hunting shoes and running shoes and gourmet shopping bags and so on and so forth. We also see the rise of the mobile phone in the 1980s, although I'd hardly call that mobile. It's the size of a truck. And also the personalized computer arising in the 1980s as well. So say hello to the Macintosh, everyone. And this is a quote from the movie Wall Street in the 1980s. Michael Douglas gave a speech that became very well known, where he said, "Greed, for lack of a better word, is good." Greed is good was one of the mantras of the 1980s. Now, while Reagan was seen as sort of the main conservative, and still today is seen as sort of like the template for American conservatism, there were some who felt that he didn't go far enough, the ultra conservatives. The fact that he cut funding for social welfare like school lunches and food stamps, he kept things like Medicare and Social Security. And while he was supporting the Christian right, he did not overturn Roe v. Wade, which is what they were hoping for. He also diversified the Supreme Court. He got the first woman on the Supreme Court, a woman named Sandra Day O'Connor, who actually ended up, even though she was a conservative in a lot of ways, she ended up being sort of a moderate swing vote on a lot of things, including reproductive rights. So she actually blocked the overturn of Roe v. Wade a few times. So here is Sandra Day O'Connor, born in 1930, died in, I believe, last year. She just passed away. She is from Texas, but lived most of her life in Arizona. She was the chancellor of the College of William and Mary. She was a state senator in Arizona. She was a state and Court of Appeals judge, and she later became a justice on the Supreme Court from 1981 to 2006. And for a time, she ran a jazzercise class for clerks in the Supreme Court gym. And I was going to put a GIF of jazzercising, but Evil Beaver actually said that he would stop my ability to record if I did that. So here is a Lady Justice saying it's about time. And even though I said she was born in 1930, she did recently just pass away. So Reagan did sort of halt federal regulation of businesses, and he also strengthened the government's control over crime prevention during this time. He was focusing on a war on crime and a war on drugs. He was focusing on tough on crime policies that had started under Nixon, but he was improving on them. This included more funding for police, more prisons, and harsher penalties for drug convictions. In 1984, he reestablished the federal death penalty. Now, during this time, there's also a lot of fear of drugs. Especially in the suburbs, drugs are the main enemy. And one of the ones that people feared most was things like cocaine. Now, the fear of crack cocaine, which was normally a lower price drug that African Americans would buy, led to an upsurge in drug related arrests and incarcerations. The police were focusing predominantly on African American drug users of this time. And the number of people arrested for drug crimes during the 1980s jumped from 50,000 to 400,000 during that time. And these are nonviolent drug offenders as well. So here's the First Lady, Nancy Reagan. She focused on just say no as her anti drug policy. How well it worked is debatable. So, while previous presidents were attempting detente with the Soviet Union, Reagan was more focused on we win, they lose. He used a lot of inflammatory rhetoric. He called them an evil empire, which raised some eyebrows at the time. He was also building up our military to new levels. He even had plans for honest to goodness space lasers during this time, hoping to shoot down Russian nuclear missiles. This was called the Strategic Defense Initiative, but most people just called it Star Wars. Reagan also put some nuclear weapons into Europe, which led to very strong anti nuclear demonstrations across the world because they were worried that basically World War III was once again right around the corner. So here's the idea of the Strategic Defense Initiative, and here's what people thought when they heard Star Wars. Now, Reagan also sent American troops around the world to fight communism. We went to the small island of Grenada in order to get rid of a pro-Cuba government that was there in the Caribbean. We also sent troops to Lebanon, but pulled them out after 241 Americans were killed by Hezbollah in a bombing in Beirut. He also sent foreign aid to support anti-communist groups, some of whom were guilty of atrocities against their own people. El Salvador, Nicaragua, the apartheid South Africa. They were not being good to their own people, but they were anti-communist. And again, that's sort of what mattered at that time to a lot of our foreign policy people when it came to is a country good or bad? Well, do they help us in the fight against communism? So here's the U.S. invasion of Grenada in 1983. It lasted a grand total of 8 days. I read somewhere that there are more medals handed out than combatants in the Grenada War. Now, in 1984, Congress banned any more funding to right-wing groups like the Contras in Nicaragua. They were fighting against the Sandinista, the far-left Sandinista government. In 1985, Reagan instead authorized sale of weapons to Iran. They were still our enemy, remember, but they were fighting a war against Iraq and needed the weapons. So in order to release some American hostages, we paid them with weapons. Now, some of the money that was going towards this was diverted to the Contras by the Reagan government, especially by a colonel named Oliver North. After this was uncovered, this is called the Iran-Contra affair in 1987. It led to congressional hearings, and Oliver North briefly went to prison. Reagan denied any wrongdoing in all of this, but it did undermine the belief that he was in control of his own administration to some degree. So they said basically, if you didn't know about it, then you're being used by your own people. However, in the end, Ronald Reagan came out one of the most powerful and still very popular presidents, especially among the conservative base. If we're talking about the conservative movement, most Republicans would say that they are quote-unquote Reagan Republicans, and he influenced a lot of modern Republicans and modern conservatism in that way. So here is Oliver North testifying in front of Congress. I believe he's a talk show host now. Now, in his second term, Reagan was also backing away from his initial anti-communism and establishing a relationship with the new Soviet premier, Mikhail Gorbachev. Gorbachev was a new kind of Soviet premier. First of all, the USSR was hitting economic problems, and Gorbachev was trying to sort of revitalize the nation, particularly through political openness known as glasnost, and economic reforms called perestroika. Now, Reagan and Gorbachev had several meetings from 1985 to 87, a series of especially focusing on like nuclear arms reduction. And a few years later, Russia pulled its troops out of Afghanistan, and very quickly after this, the Soviet Union actually collapsed. So here's Mikhail Gorbachev, who once said, "History teaches us, however, that when the times are ripe for change and the government refuses or is unable to change, either society starts to decay or a revolution begins." Gorbachev died very recently as well. So here's the fall of the Berlin Wall during the end of communism. And that is it for me teaching you stuff this year. Thank you all very much. Time for your evil final exam, and then you're done.